Well, hello, Rabbi Block. Welcome to Sophia, which is a program that I host on the Meaning of Life TV, which is a part of the Blogging Heads TV network. Um, I'm Daniel Kaufman. I'm a professor of philosophy at Missouri State University, and I'm very pleased to have with me Rabbi Barbara Block. Rabbi Block, would you like to say a few things by way of introducing yourself?
Thank you, Dan. Yes, I'm Rabbi Barbara Block. I am the rabbi of Temple Israel in Springfield, Missouri. I've been here now for a year and a half. I am a second career rabbi. I was ordained in 2010 from Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. I served Congregation Beth Aaron in Billings, Montana for 4 years before arriving in Springfield.
And just for disclosure, not that this is the sort of conversation where disclosures are necessary, but I should just tell everyone that I have a very close relationship with Rabbi Block. I chaired the hiring committee that hired her. She taught my daughter her bat mitzvah. She's the rabbi at the synagogue to which I belong, and I also serve on the synagogue's board of directors. So I couldn't be more compromised with respect to my feelings about Rabbi Block, which are strong and very positive. But the nature of the conversation is not such that will be an issue. But I just wanted everyone to know that. So, Rabbi, I wanted to have you on to talk about Judaism generally, but more specifically about Reform Judaism. In large part because the Meaning of Life TV audience is very interested in religion, but most of the programming has been either on Christianity or on, interestingly enough, Buddhism, in which there's a lot of interest in the United States, and very little on Judaism. And I find that oftentimes people don't know very much about it, and so this is going to be largely informational, with you sort of sharing your knowledge and understanding of Judaism and of Reform Judaism specifically. And so maybe what we'll do is I'll ask you some questions that'll sort of get us into these issues, and then you can expand on them to whatever degree you like. Does that sound like a good plan?
That sounds great. Thank you.
Okay, so first of all, right off the bat, I think that it's difficult sometimes for people to understand Judaism because when they think of religion, they think of Christianity, and there are ways in which Judaism is very different from Christianity, and I don't mean necessarily doctrinally, but just in what it means to say that someone's Jewish, to speak of Judaism. So maybe you could just talk a little bit on what Judaism is and what we mean when we say that someone is Jewish, or what several sorts of things we might mean when we say that someone is Jewish.
I'm going to start with being Jewish. And one is Jewish if one is born to Jewish parents, or if one joins the Jewish people through conversion. And there's more you can say about parent, which parent, and so on, but that's a simple answer. And someone who is Jewish may or may not practice Judaism.
Explain that a little bit.
So there are people who are Jewish by birth. They recognize Jewish parentage. Excuse me. So they are Jewish, perhaps as an ethnicity.
Right.
In the same way that someone might identify, it's not exactly like being Irish, but it's being a part of a people, because there is a Jewish people. So you can be a part of the people, but not practice the religion. But I have to say Judaism is more than a religion. That's one meaning of Judaism. Judaism, of course, is a religion. But I'm going to explain a bit from the perspective of Mordecai Kaplan, a rabbi of the 20th century, early 20th century in America, who said that Judaism is first and foremost a civilization, and that the religion is a part of civilization, but it's not the whole thing. So Kaplan would identify that Judaism is a culture. That culture includes foods and holidays. So you might be Jewish and celebrate Passover without having certain beliefs that we would identify with the religion. Literature. There's Jewish literature, not just the ancient literature, but there are Jewish authors, Saul Bellow, and a wide range of Jewish authors that we might consider to be part of Jewish literature. Chaim Potok, favorite of mine. And there are Jewish arts. So there's a whole culture there that is part of Judaism. And very importantly, there are Jewish values, among which I would identify welcoming the stranger and hospitality, honesty. Education is often mentioned as a strong Jewish value. And it's not that other people of other cultures might not also have those values, but these are communally considered to be important. And another value that is important is the value of community. There are some religions which are about individual salvation and about the individual. But Judaism has a very strong focus on community and the Jewish community. And I'll say in all religions you have, for instance, in Christianity, the church is the body of Christ, and in Buddhism you have the Sangha. But I think the community in Judaism has a primacy that is very special to Judaism.
Do you think that that's partly because there is this distinctive peoplehood sense of being Jewish, in addition to, in other words, someone who's let's say an Irish Catholic, you know, they're going to belong to multiple communities in a sense, because, and maybe their Irishness gives them their sense of peoplehood, whereas their Catholicism. But for Judaism, it serves these multiple roles, and so maybe that's one of the reasons why the communal aspect. Do you think that might be?
That is certainly a part of it, and the fact that for many years, in many places we've lived, Jews have been more restricted to their own people. This is not so much the case now, but
that's a good point. Yeah.
Jews in most European countries for most of history were not citizens of their country. They were basically only part of the Jewish people. And I also want to say that when we speak of Jewish culture, there is not just one Jewish culture. Some of the more well-known distinctions are Ashkenazic Jewish culture, which is German and Eastern European. My heritage and the heritage of most Jews in the United States is Ashkenazic Jewish. That's what people in America tend to think of when they think of Jewish culture.
Right.
But there's another culture called Sephardic, which came out of Spain and spread to Mediterranean lands, and also Mizrahi culture, the culture of the people who never left the Middle East. And then the culture varies from place to place. And so I see at Christmas time, Christians talk about how people in this country celebrate Christmas and how people in this part of the world celebrate Christmas. And Jews, too, have different ways of celebrating and observing, and different cultures, different music, depending on where they have lived. But our texts and our rituals tie us together.
Okay. So that's great. It's very, very thorough, and I think people will, if they don't understand that, they're not going to understand it. Let's talk now a little bit about Judaism in America, where people may be familiar with the fact that there seem to be in America various denominations of Judaism. There's what's called, obviously, Orthodox Judaism. There's what's called Reform Judaism. Somewhere in between, there's what's called Conservative Judaism, that elsewhere is called Masorti Judaism. Maybe you could talk a little bit about these. Are these denominations like the denominations of the Protestant that we find in the Protestant Church? Or what do these denote, these different designations?
one important point is that these are not different religions. That whether you are an Orthodox Jew, Reform Jew, Conservative Jew, you are still a Jew. And unlike in Christianity, where if you move, say, from being an Episcopalian to a Catholic, you need to convert. You do not convert when you change from participating as a conservative Jew to an Orthodox Jew or a Reform Jew. We're all one religion. The Reform terminology is that we are different movements or different streams. Orthodoxy doesn't like that. We haven't come to an agreement about the language that we would use. But I'm going to use the Reform terminology, that there are different movements within Judaism. And as you mentioned, these movements are American. My mother, growing up in Vienna, Austria, had never heard of Orthodox and Reform, although there were different ways of observing. There were people who were more strict about things, people who were less strict about keeping rules, but there weren't these different movements. That said, Reform Judaism actually did start in Europe, in Germany specifically. It arose for two reasons. One is that there was the Enlightenment in Europe, and during the Enlightenment, Christians started to look at their Bible as an historical document, and Jews did as well. And and I'll get back to that, but the other development that influenced the beginning of Reform Judaism is that in the early 19th century, Jews began to have citizenship in the countries where they lived in Europe, starting in France and moving to Germany and then to other countries. Until then, Jews were granted an edict of tolerance. They were allowed to live in a land or expelled and then welcomed back, depending on the whims of the local leadership. They were subject to Jewish legal authority within the Jewish community. So the rabbis and the Jewish institutions had a great deal of power over people's lives. If they had a conflict with someone in the Christian community, then that would go to the courts of the land. But internal matters were settled internally. And there was strong need for the Jewish authorities to exert control so that the people did not get in trouble with the local Christian authorities. So that started changing in 1800, and Jews were able at that time to pursue secular education. They had not been welcome before that in the universities, so the education changed. Their social opportunities changed. They had much more social intercourse with the peoples about them. And there were some who thought that it would be better if, for instance, our worship services were more like German Protestant worship services. And so they changed the worship service to be shorter and to, in various ways, resemble what their Christian neighbors were doing.
So let me just interrupt you for 1 second. I'm going to ask you a question about this.
Yeah.
And I suspect the answer is going to be both, but I'm just curious. To what extent would you say that the Reform Jewish movement is the result of the effects of the Enlightenment and modern thought on Judaism? And of course, one of the great Enlightenment philosophers was Moses Mendelssohn, who was a Jew, and who actually, I believe, Kant thought very highly of. To what extent it was because of Enlightenment and an application of this sort of more rationalistic ways of thinking to religion, and how much of it was a result of the desire to assimilate more fully because this new opportunity to sort of live, to become citizens of these countries had arisen?
It was probably both, and it probably varied with the individual, and it changed over time. And Reform started not as a capital R Reform movement, but as a small r, Jews, and remember there weren't Orthodox Jews yet either.
Right.
It was just some Jews wanted to change some things. And I think it was all of the above. Moses Mendelssohn, whom you mentioned, was someone who wanted to be a Jew in the home and the synagogue and a citizen on the street. That was his way of cutting it. He would still, by the way, be considered an Orthodox Jew by today's standards because he still followed the traditional teachings of Judaism. So, and within Orthodoxy today, there is a very wide spectrum. None of these movements or streams are monolithic. So, you asked about in America. So in America, Jews have been here since the 1600s, and this was a very fertile ground for reform because we have always been citizens since not 1776, but once we formed a government in this country, we have always been citizens of the United States. And the United States celebrates individualism and autonomy and plurality of religion. And so when Germans came to this country in great numbers in the mid-19th century, they brought with them the reforms that they had been developing in Germany. And America was a very hospitable place for these reforms. And the reform movement with capital R had not yet been established, but by that time there were definite reform congregations. And in response to the reforms, the Jews who did not think that reform was a good idea named themselves Orthodox, which in a way is not a traditional Jewish idea, right practice. But they reacted against the people who said, we don't have to do things the way we've always done them. And there hasn't, and in fact, history shows that there hasn't always been one way that things have been done. So the Orthodox Jews chose one of many Jewish legal codes, the Shulchan Aruch, and said, this is the right way.
Right, okay.
I also want to say, I speak as a Reform Jew, and at the same time, and I will defend, do apologetics for Reform Judaism. I think that we have a lot right, but I don't think that any one movement has it all right. And I think that each of the movements have good things to contribute and that we can learn from each other. So I do want to say that.
Yeah, no, and I did not, you are a Reform rabbi, and especially given how you came to the profession, to this career, you were very conscious of what you were doing. You were already highly educated before, and so you certainly believe in what Reform's take on this because of the way you came to it. You thought this through. It wasn't like you were born into something and then went straight to seminary. I mean, you really must have thought this through before you chose. Didn't you flirt with being a Reconstructionist?
I will give a bit of personal history here, if I might. That my parents, neither of them actually in some ways was a Reform Jew, but they sent us to Reform Jewish. They joined a Reform temple. It was the closest to where they were at. So I had 11 years of Reform Jewish religious school back in the 60s. It was quite a formal setting. And I then experienced Jewish life in college, at a college where we had a small Jewish student group, no rabbi. We did things ourselves. And the conservative kids kind of took over, and we prayed out of their prayer books. And so I became very familiar and to some extent comfortable with the conservative prayer service. I, like many Jews and many others, wandered around in my 20s, kind of a seeker, and had fallen out of love with Reform Judaism. And when I became a founding member of a congregation in Minneapolis, St. Paul, in 1988, one of the big questions was affiliation with the movement. And we looked both at the Reform movement and the Reconstructionist movement. And of the two, I leaned somewhat Reconstructionist, although I thought in the end we were best affiliating with any movement. That was where I was at that time.
Right.
In 2003, there was the big biennial of the Union for Reform Judaism in Minneapolis, and I attended and I heard the president, the rabbi who was president of the union, speak on Saturday morning at our big Shabbat service. And he outlined what he thought was important, and I thought he was right on all his points. And that really moved me back more into reform frame of mind. And there are a number of reasons that I have, in a way, come home to Reform Judaism, but it is not the Reform Judaism of my youth.
Yeah, and since we haven't really, we're going to talk in detail about the various elements of Reform Judaism, and so we probably shouldn't front load because people won't know what we're talking about. Just one thing. Go ahead.
Let me say, reform is not reform ed at the end. It's reform because we see Reform Judaism and our understanding as changing over time. So there's ongoing reform. It's not like we went in and we changed things, we got it right, and we stopped.
Right. We're not like the Jewish version of Calvinists, right?
Yeah,
Because that's called Reformed Christianity, right? One thing I just would mention, just so the viewers don't realize, the Reconstructionism that you mentioned. If we were to map out these denominations on a sort of a left-right spectrum, then the Reconstructionist is even more liberal, progressive than the Reform is. It should be mentioned, though, that it was created by the Mordecai Kaplan, who you mentioned,
right.
Who I believe was he not a rabbi at the Jewish Theological Seminary? So he was of the conservative movement.
And his aim was not to start a movement, but to develop a philosophy that would inform all the movements, which to some extent it has.
Yeah, he's been very influential, yeah.
Some of his followers decided they wanted their own institutions and their own congregations, and so now there's Reconstruction.
All right, so let's talk about Reform Judaism, and I will say, it is the largest denomination of Judaism or movement in the United States. I looked this up, as of last year was 35%, with the others taking up a much smaller share, and a significant chunk, about 30%, not identifying with any movement at all. And so, this is mainstream Judaism in the United States, and so it's perfectly apropos to talk about and to get into. Odds are, if you know a Jewish person, you likely know a Reform Jew. So let's start off with the first thing I wanted to ask is, one of the characteristics, it seems to me, of a lot of the modern, more liberal versions of these Western religions, whether it's the mainline Protestants or Jews like Reform Jews, because of the demographics that these religions draw from, you're likely to have people who are highly educated, who are professionals, and whose belief in the supernatural is probably not the same sort that you would find in more traditional communities. What is the official Reform view on God and the supernatural? But B, what has been your experience, and what in your estimation, and obviously this is anecdotal, of what the average layperson in the congregation's views on this are?
Okay, there is not one Reform position about God. And also within traditional Judaism, it's understood that although God does not change, unless you are a certain kind of mystic, God does not change, but our understanding of God changes. We see in the course of the stories of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, a developing understanding about God. And in our liturgy, which goes way back, one of the prayers developed by the rabbis starts out, "Blessed are you, Adonai our God, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob." And the ancient rabbis asked, why do we say God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, rather than God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? God's the same. And the answer is, this is traditional Judaism, that in each generation we have a different relationship with God. Abraham's relationship with God was different from Isaac's, was different from Jacob's. So now moving into the Reformed Jewish conception of God, that too has changed over time. And we do not have a creed. The closest we're not a creedal religion. In order to belong to a congregation, you do not have to sign a statement of faith. We're considered more covenantal. It's a matter of breed, a covenant between us as a people and God. So there's the closest we have to a creedal statement in our service is the Shema. Hear, O Israel, Adonai is our God. Our God is one. Adonai is one. So we have the oneness of God. And then you can ask, well, what does that mean? And things that we would traditionally say don't fit. There's a lot that does fit. What doesn't fit in that oneness of God is that natural objects are not God. The sun is not God.
Right.
The moon is not God. God is not the entire universe. There's something else beyond that is God. The second thing that is important, because we're in relationship with Christian culture, is that it is not a Jewish belief that God would ever be on earth incarnate as a human being. That is definitely outside what would be acceptable Jewish belief.
So let me, before you go on, let me just ask you, to refine some of this a little bit. Does Reform Judaism accept the basic notion of the God of the attributes? Omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, omnibenevolent, and does it think of God roughly as a supernatural person, right? Or are there more inchoate, vaguer?
I think they're more, at some point, various points in history, those concepts were debated. The closest we have actually to a Jewish statement from the Torah about God, I have it here, is from the book of Exodus. And God is portrayed in many, many different ways in the Hebrew Bible. But there's one point at which Moses wants to see God's face. God says, you can't see my face and live, but I'll put you in the cleft of the rock and I will pronounce my name before you. And what God says, according to the Hebrew Bible, about God is Adonai, Adonai, a God compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in kindness and faithfulness, extending kindness to the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin. Yet, God does not remit all punishment, but visits the iniquity of parents upon children and children's children upon the 3rd and 4th generation. It is overall a very positive view of God, but there are some consequences to bad behavior, but only to the 3rd or 4th generation, which in a way you can interpret naturalistically. If parents do really bad things, the reality is their children suffer.
Yeah.
But God is forgiving. God visits the good stuff you do lasts for 1,000 generations. The bad stuff to the 3rd or 4th. So it's a very positive and loving image of God. Is it all powerful? Is it omnipotent? Is it omnibenevolent? Can argue about that. There's no statement of that theological statement of that kind in our literature. I think we are far more nuanced in what we say.
Now, but that's what you just read. So that's biblical.
Right.
But in terms of Reform Judaism as a modern, liberalizing version of this ancient religious tradition. Do you, is there a difference in the way that Reform looks at God in keeping with its modernity, or not?
Okay, so there were, we don't have a creed, and we don't have an authority as such, but we have a conference of rabbis, of which I'm a member, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, my rabbinical association. And from time to time, that association has met to come out with statements of principles. And beginning with the Pittsburgh Platform in the 1900s, which was a foundational document. I'm not going to read from that. That talked about a God idea. And I'm going to read you excerpts of what the two following statements said, and then the most recent statement. So the Columbus Platform of 1937 about God starts, the heart of Judaism and its chief contribution to religion is the doctrine of the one, the living God who rules the world through law and love.
Okay.
So that's where we were in 1937 as a movement. Now, individuals might think differently.
Right, that's a separate question.
Yeah. That's what the rabbis said. The next time a platform was made was in 1976. So history had happened between 1987 and 1976. And the statement is very different about God. And this is an excerpt from the middle of the statement about God. The trials of our own time and the challenges of modern culture have made studied belief and clear understanding difficult for some. Nevertheless, we ground our lives personally and communally on God's reality and remain open to new experiences and conceptions of the divine. So, open to new experiences.
That's fascinating.
It allows for a variety, and it acknowledges that not everybody is able to believe.
That really leaves open a tremendous range of possible ways that an individual congregant may think about God. That's really fascinating. And it's worth saying, just for the audience, that the Reconstructionist movement explicitly disavowed supernaturalism. And Kaplan, as you said, rightly said Judaism is primarily a civilization. The Reform never explicitly eschewed supernaturalism, but it sounds to me like they really sort of left things in such a way that it could accommodate almost any view of the nature of the God, of sort of the nature of the Godhead, within certain boundaries. Yes. Yeah. Right. That's really interesting.
Yeah, I thought it would be to our listeners. And I want now to read the most recent, they didn't call it a platform, but the statement of principles of the CCAR, which was written, and this is by a committee of rabbis in 1999.
Okay.
And by the way, all of these were written by committees of rabbis, and they were the view of the majority. Not everybody necessarily agreed with everything said. So here's what was said, and I'm going to read it in its entirety in 1999. We affirm the reality and oneness of God, even as we may differ in our understanding of the divine presence. We affirm that the Jewish people is bound to God by an eternal brit, covenant, as reflected in our varied understandings of creation, revelation, and redemption. We affirm that every human being is created in the image of God, and that therefore every human life is sacred. We regard with reverence all of God's creation and recognize our human responsibility for its preservation and protection. We encounter God's presence in moments of awe and wonder, in acts of justice and compassion, in loving relationships, and in the experiences of everyday life. We respond to God daily through public and private prayer, through study, and through the performance of other mitzvot, the sacred obligations, to God and to other human beings. We strive for, and remember this is rabbis speaking, we would like choose all to do these things daily, whether or not everybody actually does. We strive for a faith that fortifies us through the vicissitudes of our lives, illness and healing, transgression and repentance, bereavement and consolation, despair and hope. We continue to have faith that in spite of the unspeakable evils committed against our people and the sufferings endured by others, the partnership of God and humanity will ultimately prevail. And this partnership between God and humans is a very important idea in modern day Reform Judaism. And finally, we trust in our tradition's promise that although God created us as finite beings, the spirit within us is eternal. And the summation line is, in all these ways and more, God gives meaning and purpose to our lives.
That also seems to leave a lot of space.
Yes.
Because one of the things that struck me as you were reading that is how many times they said that we encounter God in ways that are not the meeting of a person, right? I mean,
Right.
I think in Christianity, especially Protestant Christianity, there's such an emphasis on the relationship with Jesus that the notion of what it is to encounter God is very much analogous to what it is to meet another person, except that the person is a supernatural person. And this, you encounter God in the things you do in your life, and the sort of in the roles that you play, and and so that also seems to leave a lot of room for the individual congregant to sort of think of this in their own way within a certain broad frame, which is one of the things I find appealing about him. I should tell people. I mean, if people ask me, I define myself as an atheist in the sense that I don't believe that there is anything supernatural. Yet I have I'm very comfortable saying also that I belong to my religious tradition, because at least the version of it that we belong to seems to me at least to permit a pretty wide latitude of how we interact with and see our relationship to these things. I hope I haven't admitted too much, and you're not going to throw me off the board now for disclosing this. But
And I knew this before you
I
went
know. That's really, really interesting. Let's go ahead. You were going to say something.
One more thing I want to say about this. In your daughter's class, the 8th grade and high school religious school class, I was told by their previous teacher that they had an interest in God, the topic of God. And so I brought with me to the class an exercise with 21 statements about God. And for each one, they could mark, yes, they agreed with it, no, they didn't agree with it, or that they were not sure. And some of the questions are, I believe that God does not interfere in the affairs of people. I believe that God intended us never to understand certain things about the world. I believe that God rewards good. I believe that God listens to prayer. I believe that praying can benefit the person who prays, even if God doesn't listen. So there's a whole wide range of statements, 21 statements. There was not a single statement among the 21 that 6 students who responded to this all responded the same way.
So there was no consensus on any of them.
That's right. And so, that class loves debate. So I set it up with some of them where there were about even numbers of yeses and nos to talk about it. And that's, one of the meanings of Israel, we talk about the people Israel, is those who struggle with God. And I think one of the benefits to our communal religious life is talking together about these very difficult and deep issues. And I also did a similar exercise with the adults, and there was no consensus there either.
Interesting. All right, so we talked quite a bit about the view of God and of the supernatural, and let's now talk a little bit about the texts. So, first of all, maybe you might just educate the viewers a little bit, just briefly, on what are the canonical texts in Judaism. And then talk about what is the Reform attitude towards these canonical texts.
Okay, the first and most important of the canonical texts is, of course, the Hebrew Bible, comprised of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, which you may know is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and followed by the books of the prophets, the historical or historiographical books, historiographical, and then the final section of writings, which includes Psalms, Proverbs, and books including Esther and Job and Ecclesiastes and so on. So,
and this is different from an order of a Christian Bible.
Right, the order is different, and the exact books that are included are a bit different, but it's similar, and we call it the Hebrew Bible. We do not call it the Old Testament because we don't consider it old.
We don't think there's a new one.
Well, we recognize that for Christians there is a new one, but it is not our scripture.
Right, it's not new for us, yeah.
It's very important that you understand that Judaism did not stop when Christianity began. So while Christians were writing the New Testament, we were writing the Mishnah, which was compiled in the year 200, which reads more like a legal text. And by the time of the Mishnah, a lot of the culture had changed for the Jews. In the year 70, the temple was destroyed. And the temple was the site, among other things, the temple was the site of the animal sacrifices, which were what peoples of the Middle East all over and the Mediterranean, that's how they communicated with God. If you read the ancient Greek literature, before the men went to war, they sacrificed bulls to Zeus.
Right.
So, and one of the ways of interpreting the sacrificial laws in Leviticus was to limit this as much as possible. You can only do it at the temple. You can only do certain animals. And so it was in some ways seen as an attempt to limit this animal sacrifice. And by the time the temple was destroyed, the rabbis were already developing other ways of worship, of study, and of prayer. And the brilliance of the rabbis of the Mishnaic period was that they said, this is our new service. The word avodah, service, was initially applied to the sacrificial cult in the temple. And they took that same word and said, our avodah now, our service is the worship, the words. And today, we have services in the morning and afternoon. Those correspond, and the words used in Hebrew correspond to the times of the sacrifices.
Right.
And then there's an evening sacrifice as well. So they pegged it to the old culture, but brought it into modernity. And those rabbis did not say, well, we're going to throw out these old books now, particularly Leviticus, because we can't do those things anymore. They said, no, these are still our rules. And this is how we're bringing the old ways into modern times, which, by the way, is how I see what I'm doing as a Reform rabbi, bringing the received religion and the received texts into our modern times.
Right.
Because Judaism was never an unchanging thing. So the Mishnah was compiled and times continued to change, of course, because times do. And so rabbis kept writing and interpreting the Mishnah, and in the year about 500, between 500 and 600, the Talmud was redacted, was compiled. And that isn't just one book. I could hold up one book and show you the Mishnah. The Talmud is 72 volumes, the Babylonian version, which is considered the most authoritative. There was a separate Talmud in Jerusalem, which overlapped a lot because the two communities spoke to each other, but had some things in it about sacrifices that were not in the Babylonian Talmud and left out a lot of what was in the Babylonian Talmud. So we have two Talmuds. Those are the books that apply for an Orthodox Jew universally to Jews. After that, there was more dispersal among different places, and although there was a big center of Jewish learning for some centuries later in Babylonia, it was no longer considered that there was one central religious authority or one central religious writing. So rabbis wrote for their own communities and decided for their own communities. And
so once you get past the Mishnah and the Gemara, the Talmud, if we take, we're saying in a sense the Hebrew Bible and the Talmud are the sort of the canonical text of Judaism, and then later there were some very influential rabbinical thinkers like Maimonides and like Rashi. But these are not so much considered canonical texts. Am I correct in that?
The same way. Maimonides had two major works, the Mishneh Torah, in which he went through the Talmud, which is very much, thinking of the word, it's not linear. You start in the middle wherever you start, and the rabbis go from topic to topic. It's associational.
Right.
That's the word. So if you want to know about the rules for Shabbat, you have to know the entire Talmud, because they talk about Shabbat in the tractate called Shabbat, but they also talk about it throughout. Right. So Maimonides, because of the sad state of Jewish learning, and not everybody knew the whole Talmud well enough to know what the rules were, went through with his amazing mind and came up with 14 books of the Mishneh Torah, the repetition of the Torah, and said, this is what you should do based on the Talmud. These are the rules, without all the discussion, because the Talmud has many layered discussion and says, well, this rabbi says this and this rabbi says that, and then the rabbis agreed to go this way. Maimonides redacted it, but people objected to that because he didn't cite his sources and say where he was taking things from. So there were that was a code, considered a code, although it's not really a code of Jewish law. There were others written over time. I mentioned the Shulchan Aruch as well. Maimonides also wrote a more philosophical text called The Guide to the Perplexed, or For the Perplexed. So none of the major difference between all those other writings and the writings up through the Talmud is that the traditional teaching is that God gave the Torah, the first 5 books, to Moses on Mount Sinai. And it's taken that the entire written scripture was given to Moses and written down. What the rabbis who wrote the Mishnah and the Talmud did was considered oral law based on that scripture. And there are two ways that are traditionally related. One is that God really told the whole thing to Moses. And Moses didn't write it down. Moses told it to Joshua. Joshua told it to the elders, told it to the men of the Great Assembly. And so all the rabbis of the Mishnah and Talmud were doing was repeating orally what Moses had passed along, and then eventually it got written down.
And the impetus to write it down was because of the dispersal, right? The Jews had been dispersed in the land, and so, well, we better write this down, or these oral knowledge is going to get lost. That's the
And but the other explanation is, which seems a little more realistic, is no, God didn't give Moses all of this, and all of this wasn't repeated. But God gave Moses the rules for how to interpret, and there are compilations of those rules. So if you read Mishnah or Talmud, it'll say, based on this piece of scripture, you get this, and they're following certain rules of interpretation.
Right.
If you study those as a modern scholar with a modern hat on, and you ask the question, is this exegesis of the text? Is the Mishnah simply the explication of what's already in the Torah, which is how the rabbis presented it? That was their authority. Or is this eisegesis? They're reading things in that they want to see. And it's pretty clear, if you're a modern reader, that it's eisegesis.
Right.
The rabbis were creating a religion for their times and saying, here's the proof text.
Right. Although, as you properly pointed out, there really is no choice but to do that, right? I mean, look, I'll just give a very simple example that people will, I think, understand immediately. You know, one of the laws that you find in the Bible is that you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath, and clearly this is meant to sort of ensure that people are not sort of slave driven in their lives. There's a sort of a consideration to the person, to the individual, and to the person's family, and to this need for time that's spent not working. But of course, what counts as work depends entirely on the circumstances, on the context. What counted as work in 500 BCE might not be any labor at all in 2015. And so it's really not possible to follow these rules unless what they mean is updated, right?
Well, let me say that it says nothing in the Torah about what
counts as work. That's right.
You shall not work at your occupations. And when I say that our religion, whether you're Orthodox, Reform, whatever, the Jewish religion is not the religion of the Bible, which was based on sacrifice. Now, there are commandments in the Bible that we still would include as parts of Judaism. You shall not murder.
Yeah.
And there are lots of commandments that are a part of it. And you shall observe the Shabbat. You shall observe the Sabbath. That is part of our religion. But how we observe that was developed later by the rabbis. And what they did was they were primarily an agricultural society. They said, if you go through the Torah, there are 39 activities that are listed as agricultural work.
Right.
And so all the traditional restrictions are based on those. And what happened, so that is, and for an Orthodox Jew, those come from God.
Right.
Because the traditional view is that God told Moses, told the rabbis, and so they were just, so this is what God wants.
Right.
For a Reform Jew who sees this all from a more modern historical perspective, this was the development of the religion of the times, but we don't have to be bound to it. And when I was growing up in the 60s in the Reform congregation, in what is now called classical Reform, I was told that the essence of Judaism, not of Reform Judaism, but the essence of Judaism is ethical monotheism. And that the ritual was secondary. And the ritual is what comes out of the Halakha. So philosophers have since abandoned the idea of essences and essentialism, and so have Reform Jews. And Reform Judaism, though, has moved back to embracing more of the traditions. And we recognize that without those traditions, it's hard to say what Judaism even is. For instance, I don't know too many Reform Jews who don't light Hanukkah candles. And they light one candle the first night, and 2 candles the second night, and 3 candles the third night. That is from traditional Jewish law.
Right.
That is, which is called halakha. We don't think that God told us to do that, even if it's written in the Talmud. But that's what we recognize as Judaism. If you throw all that away, what do you have? And even at the most classical Reform periods, when ritual was actively shunned, still what we did was based in that tradition.
Right.
Our worship service, even when we prayed in English, followed some traditional rubrics, and we would light candles. We wouldn't light them at the right time, according to Orthodoxy, but we lit 2 candles because that's what Jews do, and that was coming from the Halakha.
Yeah, and look, I mean, I'm old enough to remember when Reform was much more Reform in the sense of, I can remember back in the 70s when if you went into a Reform synagogue, no one was wearing a talit. No one was wearing a kippah, a skull cap. Maybe the rabbi was. And if the rabbi had a talit, it looked like it was like this wide. And it was like it almost looked like something a priest would wear.
I don't happen to have one, but if you're moving around in front of the congregation, those actually are much more practical.
Yeah. And now, if you go to a reform service, you'll see plenty of people wearing tallits. Most of the men wearing kippot, some of the women as well. And it's much more. It looks much more now like what a conservative service looked like back in the 70s than a reform one does. And I guess part of the danger of that going so far that way is if you get rid of all the practices and the rituals, then all that's left is belief, and you wind up being almost forced in a creedal direction, which is not something you want to do, right? And I also think that there is a sentimental connection to the holidays and the traditions. And I mean sentimental in a good sense, not in a bad sense. That connects people. Certainly, if it would have had no appeal to the reform services of the 60s and 70s would have no appeal to me at all, precisely because they don't connect me in that sentimental way to tradition, history, people, and so on and so forth. Let me just ask you, while we're talking about the Bible for a minute and how Reform Judaism thinks of it, what about the question of historicity? What is the Reform view? You said, well, Moses didn't. We probably didn't get this. Didn't get the whole thing from God. We got some of it from God. Was there actually a Moses at all? I mean, we now know pretty much from scholarship that there was no Exodus from Egypt. That's a myth.
Latest scholarship that's more in question.
Well, but you know what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, there's all sorts of scholarship that's going to come out that's going to show that various things that are in this text didn't happen or happened very differently, or that. Right. My question is, what is the Reform view with respect to the historicity of what's in the Hebrew Bible?
Okay, you have to take it part by part. First 11 chapters, the story of creation and the flood and so on. But we're pretty sure there was a flood. There's evidence of that because it's in the literature of many different ancient peoples, but those are at the level of mythological stories. They're very important. They teach us important things, but we don't take those as historical. Beginning with Abraham and Abraham's family, some of that may have happened in some way, but it still does not have the historical backing that we say it all happened the way this was written here. Exodus, actually, there is some evidence. There were peoples in Egypt who came and were enslaved and left, and it might have been one of those peoples. I don't think we'll ever find the evidence to say, oh, yes, this happened exactly this way. And even if there was a people who was in Egypt and enslaved and left and formed the people of Israel, it's not likely that the details are all there. And I don't think that's particularly important because it's important how we learn from that. And there are places where, in fact, there are seeming contradictions in the text to a modern mind. In the ancient mind, for storytelling, it doesn't matter that at one place it says Noah was told to take 7 pairs and then was told to take 2 pairs. It was probably different versions of the story that were melded together. And it was richer if you had more different versions.
Yeah. They didn't have the same conception of history in the ancient world as we do.
Right,
I'm just wondering about whether Reform has an official position on these matters of the historicity of the text and of the stories therein.
What we're taught is, we're open to whatever scholars find. Now, when you get into the books of the historiographical, the books that are historiographical, there are bases. We know there was the kingdom of Israel, and that there were various dispersals. And by the way, but they were written with a theological bent. And for instance, the northern kingdom is always doing the wrong thing. Their leaders are always bad. The southern kingdom is always good. Guess which survived to write the history?
The southern kingdom, right?
Okay. So we can put 2 and 2 together, but we can be pretty sure there was a northern kingdom, there was a southern kingdom, that much of what we read there has a basis in truth, but is told from a point of view for a reason.
Right. So I guess what I'm asking is, Reform Judaism is comfortable with modern science and geology and stuff, and so it's not going to insist upon 6 day special creation, right?
Well,
Right.
I think I can safely say that Reform Judaism rejects
Right.
that kind of
Right.
literal.
The question is whether, in addition, does Reform Judaism accept whatever the consensus view of modern scholarship is in history? It does in science, but does it also with respect to history? In other words, if let's hypothesize, if it turns out that there's overwhelming consensus the Exodus didn't happen, right? Does the Reform movement accept that sort of a judgment from secular scholarship, or are there limits to what it will accept?
No, it would accept that.
Okay.
It would, and there is no it. There's we.
The rabbinical assembly or whatever they call it.
There are three institutions in Reform Judaism. I mentioned the Union for Reform Judaism. That is actually a union of congregations. So our congregation, Temple Israel, belongs to that union. There is the Central Conference of American Rabbis. We come out with statements and position papers and so on. And then there's the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, which is our seminary where our scholars reside. And they don't all agree with each other, by the way. There's the question of the documentary hypothesis, which is very popular, that you can separate out the first 5 books of the Bible and say these are J and these are E and P and D. And the first class I had in Cincinnati, 8 o'clock Monday, Wednesday morning, was taught by Dr. David Aaron, a biblical scholar, who told us that he believed that there was not good support for documentary hypothesis. He made a very convincing case, and I drew in my notebook the words documentary hypothesis, put a circle and a slash through it. No documentary hypothesis. We had a 5-minute break, and our next course was the biblical history taught by Dr. Michael Cook, who came in and spoke about the documentary hypothesis as if it were fact. There isn't one view, even among these scholars who are teaching at the same institution, any more than all of you in your philosophy department would have agreement. But there is agreement between Dr. Cook and Dr. Aaron that these texts were written by humans over a period of time. Dr. Aaron's point is that you can't separate them into these 4. You can't go verse by verse and separate them into these 4. So, and there would be consensus among these scholars on the point you bring up.
Is there not a governing body, though, that makes decisions with respect to, like, for example, so I have some association with the conservative movement. I used to work at the Jewish Theological Seminary. And when things like issues would come up, like, can we ordain women?
Right.
Or can we marry gay and lesbian couples? Right. At least in the conservative movement, there is a governing body that makes these decisions. Is there a governing body in the Reform movement that makes these decisions, or are these left to individual congregations?
They are. There is not quite the structure that there is in the conservative movement, but what we have is a group of rabbis, and I'm actually part of that group. We meet electronically to consider positions that would they are advisory to rabbis. And this is in a long history. I mentioned the Talmud and I mentioned the codes. The largest body of Jewish legal literature is neither of those. It is the responsa literature, in which a community or a rabbi from one community will ask a more authoritative rabbi what to do in a particular case, because there are always new things coming up.
Right. And
in the Reform movement, and in some places this is done by a single rabbi. There are different rabbis who will issue opinions, and depending on what a community thinks of them, they'll follow this rabbi or that. In Reform Judaism, we have a committee, the Responsa Committee, chaired by Dr. Mark Wachowski, and any rabbi, Reform rabbi, can send a question to Dr. Wachowski, often medical ethics issues, because that field is ever changing, and sometimes practical issues or community issues. And Mark will send out to us the question and any of the traditional sources that would apply, Talmudic or otherwise, and we'll have a discussion. I mostly listen because I'm listening to some of the greater minds in my movement, but every once in a while I have something to add. And the question that just came out this week was on tahara. There is a practice in Jewish burial that you wash the body according to certain rituals and dress it, and Jewish halakha says the way to dispose of the body is through burial in the ground. Mm-hmm. More Jews have been choosing cremation against the tradition, but Jews do choose cremation, and most Reform rabbis, and I believe some conservative, will officiate at the burial of cremains. So the question came up, can you do tahara for someone who's being cremated? And I had something to add, that I have actually participated in tahara for the body of a woman who was then cremated. She was very poor. It was a small community, not my community in Montana. The community didn't see a way to come up with the money for the burial. The family was pretty much destitute, and so cremation was really the only option. It wasn't even that she had chosen it, but it was all that was available. But we thought that, and there was discussion in the community, and it was decided that we would honor the traditional practices as much as possible and do the tahara in preparation for the cremation. So, things come up all the time.
But there's not, it's not as if, there's not a governing body that then after they decide, I mean, could, our congregation marries gays and lesbians, right?
Right.
Can a congregation in Mississippi say we're not marrying gays and lesbians because it says in the Bible that this isn't in other words, is there any governing authority that sort of imposes?
Well, in addition to the response committee, which did have a position on we recognize gay and lesbian marriages, there are also resolutions of the CCAR as a whole. And it was resolved some time ago that rabbis were permitted to officiate and and the same with intermarriage between Jews and non-Jews. It was left to rabbinic discretion.
So there's diversity of practice.
There's a variety of practice, but the consensus is moving towards pretty much everyone I know in the Reform movement will officiate at the wedding of gays and lesbians. Not every rabbi will officiate at an intermarriage. That in some ways is a more difficult question for us.
Yeah. And the reason it's more difficult for us is because we know that intermarriage plays an enormous role in a sense, reducing of the shrinking of the Jewish population, because the data shows us that those who intermarry are much less likely that the generations that follow of those families are much less likely to be Jewish, and so there's a real concern as to what to do about this. Whereas with gays and lesbians, there isn't that concern, right?
Rabbis, right? For rabbis, there's a variety. That's one concern, which some people would put more emphasis on than others. There are a variety of reasons why Reform rabbis do and don't choose to officiate at intermarriages. And part of the deal is we don't have a pope. Catholic Church has a pope who issues edicts, and pretty much, although Catholic Church is not monolithic either,
right?
But the expectation is that these rules are going to be followed. Whereas we have discussions, and my authority as a rabbi is based in my education, my knowledge of Jewish texts and traditions, and in the selection of me as the rabbi of the congregation. That's where the authority is based in, but it's really the authority to persuade. I also cannot tell my community, you have to do thus
Right.
and such.
Right. You don't even have the authority over your community that a parish priest has over his, probably in terms of what you could directly tell people to do.
Although I do have freedom of the pulpit, so I get to say what I feel is the right message. But I take into account when I'm thinking about what message to give, where people are at and what they can hear at a given time,
Right.
which is actually what the rabbis of the Talmud said as well. You know, the rabbis of the Talmud said you should not make a rule which the people cannot follow.
Yeah. No, that's, yeah. So we're just at an hour and 10 minutes, and so we probably don't want to push on too much longer.
Right.
I did have one last thing I wanted to ask you, and you're a very good person to ask this question. We didn't go into all of Rabbi Block's biography, but one of the notable things about her is that she has a master's degree in philosophy. So had a brief flirtation with an academic career, and this question is particularly, I think you're particularly well suited to answer this. And the question is this: so within the framework of reform, we've dropped really to a great extent the idea of sort of divine sanction, right? That it's the reason why we do why we follow the laws, the reason why we go to services, the reason why we do all these things is because God commands it and God must be obeyed. This has loosened up a lot from your own description. Even what we think of God as is given tremendous latitude. So the question I then have is this: in that framework, what real reason is there to belong to to be a part of the Jewish community? I can read moral philosophy, and I can decide what moral point of view, what moral framework best fits my conscience, and I can lead an ethical life by following a chosen moral philosophy. I could read John Stuart Mill, I can read Immanuel Kant, I could read Aristotle. I can live an ethical, productive, good life without any of this. So in the absence of that divine sanction, what do you see as the primary reasons for affiliation, for belonging to the Jewish community?
Well, you could also just read Jewish philosophy. There's Kant and there's Mill coming from one tradition. You could read Maimonides. You could read Heschel. You could read any of a number of Jewish philosophers. And reading philosophy and thinking about it, as you know, does not necessarily lead to ethical action. If you can just do it all in your head, that's pretty impressive. But for almost all of us, if not all of us, just understanding ideas doesn't get us there. And you can read a page, but I know also in the philosophical community, the idea that I'm aware of is that you reach truth in part by testing it out within a community of people who are reading the same things you are and trying to reach a consensus about what's right. And that, in the best case, in a Jewish community, is what we should be about, is reading our thinkers and engaging with our tradition and then using that as a spur to a good life. And the rituals that we have developed over many centuries, I think, really contribute to living a good life and to teaching values that I think are important. And
How so? Give me some examples.
Passover Seder, yes, I'm coming to that.
Yeah.
Passover Seder is most Jews attend even if they've really walked away from the religion for the most part. And in the Passover Seder, we're instructed to see ourselves as having made that journey from being slaves in Egypt to freedom. And we reenact that. That's what the Passover Seder does. We tell a story, but through telling the story and doing the rituals, we reenact being slaves in Egypt and then being redeemed and brought into freedom. And by doing that, I think we internalize those values in a way that simply reading them is never going to do.
Yeah.
And in the community and in the discussion of what does it mean for us this year. And the texts, there are lots of ways to study the texts and lots of ways to learn from them. This past Shabbat, the portion was the first 7 plagues. And we read about the first plague, the plague of blood. The Nile turns to blood. And what does Pharaoh do? Pharaoh turns and goes into his house. What do the people do? The people dig around for water. Okay? Why is that plague happening? It's because there's something wrong in the society with the enslavement of the Israelites. And by the way, in the first chapter, which we read the previous week, it's very clear that it's not just Pharaoh. A leader cannot enslave a people without others in the society cooperating. So you've got a people who are so it's not just innocent people who suffer in the plagues. These people are involved, it's very clear, in being oppressors. And so the plagues are a wake-up call. And what do? And they're inconvenienced, to use a word from Black Lives Matter. The people who don't have water in the Nile are inconvenienced. They have to dig around for water. So that was the situation then in the plagues then. The lesson I take for it from today is if there are plagues, if we are being inconvenienced, if we're having problems with our climate, with more tornadoes and natural events, you can choose any of a number of things which seem to be plagues today. Well, how are we going to respond to being inconvenienced and to having these plagues? Plague of gun violence, you could choose that one. Are we going to go into our own houses, look after our own interests, or ask, why is this happening? How do we as a society need to respond?
Right.
So these stories are stories, and they're very rich, and we'll see different things in them from year to year. And story has a power sometimes that rules that philosophy doesn't necessarily have, that even the commandments don't have, although the commandments are a good thing to hold on to too, because they're there because we have lots of temptations. And just the commandments and even the stories, all of that together does not guarantee that every individual is going to lead a good life.
Right. No, I like what you're saying. I mean, it sounds to me what you're saying is, and this is true both in religion and in outside of religion, is that belief in a series of propositions is not enough. That one has to participate in ethical culture, right? And that what a religion like Judaism does is it provides an entire sort of form of life to operate in, as opposed to simply a list of propositions. And that's why sort of the rule-following view even of religion is mistaken, right? Because it tries to reduce it all to a list of propositions without the realization that, well, these need to be lived. And when you live them, you realize the complexity of all of them, right? Which is why we need all of this exegetical literature and interpretive literature, because there isn't a list of propositions that we can just and live good lives. I mean, it sounds to me like what you're saying. Right.
And if you want to know what our goals are, because, Kant is so global, there's the golden rule. Golden rule is good to a point. And we, of course, have Leviticus 19, love your neighbor as yourself. But we also need specific instruction. And there's certain things we repeat over and over again in our liturgy and our reading. When we talk about God, we thank God in the morning blessings for freeing the captive. What that says is freeing the captive is a good thing. We need to do it. That's where the partnership with God comes in. So one way to see some of the prayers is they're telling us what it is to lead a good life, not in some very high-level philosophical ways, because you can get lost. You can spend your life gazing upon the beauty of the of the rules. But these are what we should do. And Judaism, by the way, says you're supposed to pray 3 times a day. You're supposed to pray, but it's also limited. You're not supposed to spend your entire day in prayer. You're supposed to pray, get your feet on the ground through doing that, and then go out and do.
Yeah, yeah. So this is really great. We're at about an hour and 20 minutes, and that's about the limit of what we can expect the audience to pay attention to. I want to thank you very much for doing this with me and walking us through some pretty complicated and some pretty deep questions. And I really appreciate this very much. Thank you.
Thank you. I very much enjoyed it. We have time for one last thing.
Go ahead. Why don't you close us? You close us out.
So yesterday I saw a question on someone's blog. If there were 100 people visiting the Louvre, the museum in Paris, and you had to make a choice, this is a good philosophical thing, you had to make a choice between saving those 100 lives or saving all the life contained in the Louvre, which would you save?
You mean all the art in the Louvre?
Yeah, right. But in order to save all the art in the Louvre, you'd have to kill 100 people. And
I'm the wrong person to ask this.
Okay.
Only because I teach aesthetics.
I know you teach aesthetics. But aside from maybe a stray aesthetics teacher, it's hard for me to imagine a Jew saying, save the art. Talmud teaches the one who saves a single life is the one who has saved the entire world. And on this blog, I was shocked at how many people
said save the art.
Said save the art, and had all sorts of reasons for it. You can do good philosophical reasons for all kinds of things. But I bring that up in part because sometimes it seems like we're all reaching kind of an even ground, and it doesn't matter which religion you follow because they all teach kind of the same thing. And I would say yes and no, not altogether. There's some places in which Judaism gives a very clear answer that I appreciate. As much as the rabbis engage in debate over the finer points of how, cases and what the best way is to be, there are some values that shine through that I think are worthy.
Well, I think that's a very good note to end on then. So I look forward, maybe we'll do this again on another topic, and I will certainly see you around the synagogue. And
very good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan.
All right, take care, Rabbi.
You too. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.